minutes.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, especially since I wrote it myself. Let me find my slides. It's going to give me what? That's what I want, right? Okay. Does this work? It works. Good morning. I want to start by thanking Leslie Francis in particular and Marjorie Greenberg for co-sponsoring and the other co-sponsors of the meeting that allowed us all to gather here today and meet with our colleagues and so forth. I didn't really learn yesterday. I expected, but it was confirmed yesterday. There's a lot of really interesting, smart folks in the room, and one thing I regretted yesterday was not asking people when you ask us questions to introduce yourself and tell us who you are. So I hope that when you grab the microphone, you'll tell us who you are so we can figure out who we want to meet afterwards. So I'm going to talk today, well, first of all, I have to give you the required disclosure having nothing to do with privacy disclosure. I'm not speaking for any of these people. Officially, I'm speaking for my own expertise, okay? Oh, what's going to appear again? So, good morning. In the middle there, it says, good luck with the American healthcare system. What I want to talk to you about, since we're co-sponsored by NCVHS, what I was asked to talk to you about is sort of give an overview, really, for the people who are not familiar with the committee's work of what they've been doing in the last few years, and a reminder, really, for those of you who have been involved with the committee's work and are familiar with it, about what it is that the committee has decided, done, recommended, what its activities have been, what it's recommended to the Secretary in the last few years. So I'm going to start around 2005 for a couple of reasons. One, because there's a sort of confluence of events that happened just before that, the creation of the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, which, although Nick called it on shit yesterday, we don't call it that anymore because mispronunciations are too easy. We just call it LNC. And around that time, there was, a lot of interest, a lot of movement toward health IT, in particular. Senator Bill Frist, you may know, is the MD in the Senate, was, promising and wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, lauding what's going to happen when we get electronic health records. And so there was a lot of pressure both from the Congress and the administration to be working on this. At that time, the committee had completed a series of letters, recommendation letters to the Secretary on HIPAA implementation, was ready to move on to something else. And on February 23rd, I remember the date distinctly because it was my second day at HHS when I appeared at the first NCVHS hearing. It was a nice beginning to my career there. First, in an important series of hearings, really, having to do with privacy and confidentiality in the NHIN, which continues today. So those letters started under the leadership of Mark Rothstein, who we're glad to have here today, and continue with John Houston and Leslie Francis. So the first sort of seminal letter in this group of letters dealt with really basic issues about privacy and confidentiality in the NHIN. And there were a series of hearings. So I should step back a little and say that the way that the committee goes about its business normally is to hold a series of hearings, get a bunch of experts in to come talk to us, who are usually willing to do so, and some of you in the room have done that. And then from that and from other sources that we have, draft a letter of recommendations to the Secretary and get it cleared through the committee. We find in the Subcommittee on Privacy, Confidentiality and Security, which is now called, we met for a while, presented a letter in June 2006. Actually, 3 meetings earlier than that. It took several meetings because of the nature of the letter to get it through the committee. Lots of negotiating about what it would say. And this is what I would call a wide-ranging seminal report. Marjorie gave you yesterday the website for NCVHS. The full language of the letters is up there. if you want to see in detail what the reasoning was and so forth that went into those letters. But I'm just going to give you a summary of kind of the issues that we talked about. So this was a wide-ranging letter that covered a bunch of basic issues and is the basis for current work. We're sort of jumping off of that same 2006 letter and continuing to do more detailed work. And so the letter gave a nice background, sort of blah, blah, here you are. Oh, I have this nice little pointer, blah, blah, blah. Talking about the back. Are that we think of it normally as being, privacy normally as being essential for individual care, but we don't think about it as being important for public health. But the idea is that if people are not comfortable giving their information to their provider, they're going to not show up. They're not going to tell the provider that they've got an STD or some other communicable disease, and that's going to affect everybody's health. So privacy is not just an individual thing; it's important for the whole community. And it made acknowledgement of other kind of equities that are in there that we can all differ for one reason or another about privacy. Gave some background about the fragmentation of records. We talked about this yesterday, about the fact that it sort of creates by default privacy, which might be a good thing. But the idea is that we want to keep the privacy that we have today. When we go electronic, we don't want to lose those kinds of things that people can do with the records. So, for example, I can go to my doctor and I can say, I had a test for HIV at an anonymous place, and I'm going to tell you about that, but I really don't want you to write it in my record. And if you have a good relationship with your doctor might do that. But if you took that test somewhere and now you have all your records connected together, you lose the ability to kind of control some of that. Now, we don't want to recreate all those things because then we lose the advantages of the network. So we want to be able to keep the privacy and fix those problems that we have with the fragmentation of records. So the most difficult issues that the committee was presented with had to do with whether we should allow people to opt out of or opt in to the NHIN at all, and what happens about controlling their own access. And there were certain acknowledgments about how this works, that we can't really predict how it's going to grow or happen and so forth, and talked a little bit about the difference between what happens if we have a lot of flexibility. Well, we have the ability to give people more granular ways of controlling their information and more rights, but it also becomes more expensive and more complex, and that's not always a good thing. If we have more uniformity, it's easier to comply with, easier to understand, might be less expensive, but then we lose out on the ability to have a lot of variety in what kinds of rights or choices people have. So here's some of the recommendations that were made in that first letter. That we understood that you can't walk into your doctor's office and say, I don't want you to keep my records electronically. Businesses have to run their business the way they want. So the committee said, we're not going to allow that. But they said, if you're going to send information over the NHIN, you should have the ability to decide somehow whether or not that should happen. We didn't decide, the committee did not recommend whether that should be an opt-out or opt-in process. And they made some other recommendations that are very important seminal things, not conditioning treatment on participation, and having the department sort of do its good work in monitoring and promoting research and things like that. And then we talked about more about control issues and got into the discussion about what happens when you allow patients to control what's in their electronic health record, their clinical record. Now, this letter was confined to that information which is sent over the network, so not records in a hospital that stay in the hospital or in your doctor's office that stay in your doctor's office. And for a variety of reasons, to get agreement on the letter, that was the limitation of this letter. But my feeling is that that's just leaves open future questions for the committee maybe to take up. It's not that the committee has decided never to take up those issues or to expand its scope, but just that it didn't do so in this letter. So, the idea that, that people should not be able to control the content of their EHRs, partly it's against state law. Like you have to keep the integrity. If you're a medical professional, you have to keep the integrity of your records together, and usually you're allowed to append the record with a comment, but not to delete anything in there. And there are concerns about care decisions and malpractice and so forth. And then on the other side, you have folks who really believe that individuals should be able to control some content in their records. Some of the information might be particularly sensitive, old, irrelevant, could cause embarrassment, all those reasons that we know. And for the public health reasons that I said, people will be reluctant to get care. And in particular, we heard from some emergency physicians who said, you know what, when I'm treating somebody, I don't really need to have the whole record. What I need is a certain set of minimal things. I need your name, your date of birth. I don't really need your name. I need your date of birth. I need maybe your recent diagnoses. I need whether you're allergic to anything, that kind of thing, right? And that, in an emergent situation, I can do my job, and anything else, it's not emergent, where I'm not able to give consent or withhold consent, you should be able to ask me. So they made some regulatory recommendations too, and most of them I use the exact language, but some of them I paraphrased because they were long and there was a lot of wordsmithing and so forth. But you get an idea of the kind of things that the committee was interested in. Oops. I lost something in there. Okay. So then the letter went on to talk about other kinds of controls. And I just wanted to mention the idea of medical record banking. I don't want people to think that the NHIN and its particular structure is the only way that records might be organized. So there's a group out there that thinks that the way to do this, to give patients control, is to have medical record banking. So you'd assign a trustee, like a bank or some other trusted party, to hold in a central location all your medical records, and then by consent, you would say, yes, this doctor, no, that doctor, and so forth. And that if you had a consortium of organizations that would agree to store their records that way, it would make it administratively easier for them. They have a financial model for how that might work, and they think that would improve patient choices and patient control. I personally think that's very impractical. I don't think it's likely to work. I don't think that providers who have records now are likely to, pay somebody to store them, and also they might be paying somebody to store them, but they're unlikely to want to give up control. And they have control now, so they don't have to. And also, I think that consent for every single disclosure, I'm a privacy advocate, but it's a pain, to have to think about every disclosure. What I really want is for the organization to have a really good set of defaults that make sense, or a few choices about what the defaults might be, and I can choose from column A, B, C, or D, that's close to what I think it should be. And there are other models out there that do that. They give you sort of limited groups of choices that most people will think are okay. So two of the important things in that letter had to do with role-based access and contextual access criteria. Role-based access being sort of in a hospital, there's, 80 some odd people who have a right to look at your record, but maybe the person who's bringing you your dinner doesn't need to see your entire medical record. They need to see your nutrition information, or the billing office doesn't need to know everything about it, right? So depending on your role, we can assign you what parts of the record or record that you need. And the nice thing about this is that these kinds of things are already being incorporated by industry. You can find EHRs that have these kind of things in them, these kind of choices. Contextual access criteria is about what happens when you go to get a job, or you go to get a loan, or you go to get insurance from a non-health insurer, life insurance, disability insurance, so for long-term care insurance. Those are not covered by HIPAA, and they have you sign a form that says, give us all your medical records so we can decide whether to underwrite and so forth. So there are a lot of non-medical uses of health information out there, and you're in a bind. If you want life insurance, you pretty much have to sign that away, or they're not going to do business with you. And the idea of contextual access criteria is, even if you sign the consent, there's a certain amount of stuff that's relevant to that decision, and that's the kind of stuff that we should disclose. And everything else, we don't have to disclose. The stuff that's related to mortality or whatever, give it to the life insurers, but other things that are not relevant, they don't need to see. So there were recommendations based on these kinds of ideas as well, that we should employ these kind of things, and that HHS should convene people in an open way and should support research and those kinds of recommendations. So let's go on to the next letter, which had to do with non-covered entities. So we held a series of hearings. I was thinking as I was looking at the series of hearings we had before, back in the day we had 4 or 5 hearings a year. That doesn't happen anymore for budget reasons. But in 06 and 07, we had a series of hearings on non-covered entities. There was a lot of interest in, or there was sort of a mystery about who's not covered. And we actually discovered, to our surprise and sometimes to our chagrin, about all the different kinds of entities that have lots of health information that are not covered. You pay cash, your doctor only takes cash, you're not covered because your doctor isn't covered unless the doctor is submitting electronic claims. So boob job, usually cash only, not covered. Okay, lots of medical information there. Medical spas, we heard from certain kind of insurers that I mentioned, employers not covered, schools are not covered, particularly because they're covered by another law. If you pay your oncologist with your credit card and it says Oncology Associates on the business line, then probably people are going to figure out what's going on there, that sort of thing. And that culminated in a letter in June 2007. You can see it takes a little bit of time to get these things through. So here's examples of the kind of folks we talk to. The testing labs are the people you go to the CVS. I don't know what you have you have CVS out here? The drugstore. And you buy a lab kit that allows you to see whether you're HIV positive or your kid has, is doing drugs or whatever it is, and you send it off to the lab, and that's not covered. Anyway, so there are a lot of things that are using information that is health information that's very sensitive. They're not covered by the current HIPAA rule. And so we made recommendations that, and I think really this is probably the most radical recommendation that the committee has ever made, which is that everything should be covered. And we've been everything. So, right? And Mark's nodding his head. So, huh? It's true. It's pretty radical. Regulate the world. So the Secretary hasn't taken that up yet. It might happen, but it's moving that direction. We're regulating more things in the Recovery Act, expanded to business associates, expanded to certain kinds of things related to personal health records and so forth. And then we started to talk about consumer controls, and we had another hearing so I think my slides are not right, but okay. So the next group we did had to do with consumer controls for sensitive records, which is the part that I think is particularly interesting. And we tried to figure out if there were entities out there that had an experience with consumer controls. What I mean by that is, using particular categories of information or particularly ways of segregating or controlling information that will allow the patient to decide what they do and don't want to be shared related to their clinical records. And we had some really interesting specialty folks come in. Oops. Maybe my slides are not in the right order. Okay, I'm going to stop using this because this is not right. All right. Okay. Okay. So, yeah. Oh. Okay, get off that button. I have the wrong slides up here. Okay, well, so, all right, so we heard from a bunch of kind of interesting specialty practices. People who you might not think have particularly sensitive information. We heard from physical therapists, dentists. I mean, how many people think their information at their dentist is the kind of thing that you would call particularly sensitive? I wouldn't until I heard the dentist testify that from looking at my teeth, they can tell whether I have bulimia. They can tell whether I'm abusing drugs. They can tell what kind of medications I might be taking because they discolor my teeth. And I was, pretty surprised. Some of that I knew, but some of it I was pretty surprised by. The physical therapist came along and said, you know, we see people's whole bodies when they come in for therapy, and I can see bruises on them. I can tell if they're being abused. And so we find sensitive information in places that you might not think. And it's sort of commingled with other information that you might not think is sensitive. And so since my slides are a mess for some reason, these are not the right slides. I'm going to wing it. What the committee said was, you know, they looked at different ways that you might control information, and what they said was, we think the right thing to do is to allow patients to, within certain categories of information that should be well defined and well understood, we should allow people to segregate their information from their main medical record. And they gave committee gave examples of categories like that. They talked about mental health, the ones you might think, mental health records, substance abuse, reproductive health, excuse me, genetic information, which Mark is going to talk about in a little bit. What am I missing? There were 5 categories. Domestic violence. And said, you know, patients should be able to segregate that information out of their record, but have it available if it's needed. And what does that mean? Sort of when I think about how the discussion went, it was sort of the doctors and lawyers, you know, doctors want to heal people. They're trained to fix things, and they want to heal people, and they want to do good. And the way they do that is by fixing people and by having all the information that they need to make good choices. And lawyers, here we are lawyers, want to, you know, protect people's rights. And they want to allow people to make choices, even if those choices are bad, you know, you have the right to make those bad choices. And in particular, you have the choice to not give information to your doctor and to have a bad result, and in fact, to die as a result. And that's good protection of your rights, right? The doctors don't like that so much. And so, you know, we have a kind of a policy conflict about, you know, how that is supposed to work. And the doctors are very concerned about, is that fair? We have doctors sitting here. That the doctors are concerned about, you know, helping their patients and making good choices and having the information to do that. And they're concerned about what happens if they didn't know information that's somewhere in the record. Should they be liable or responsible to know? And I also worry about the other side, which we don't as much hear about, which is what happens if you're responsible to know everything that's in the record from womb to tomb, right? Cradle to grave, or the one I like best is sperm to worm. You know, all that information, if you have access to it and you can see it, would be your responsibility also. And so you got liability either way. I mean, I think it's difficult. They're difficult choices for doctors. So those are some of the issues we came up with in this sensitive categories of information letter, and you know, recommended that the secretary look into it, that we do research on it, and talked about whether there should be methods where behind the scenes we can avoid errors. So for example, if you're not seeing all the mental health medications, can we make sure you get some kind of alert that says, wait a minute, before you prescribe this thing, you ought to ask the patient more questions about something, or in other kind of conflicts like that. We talked about whether the physician would get notice if there's information missing. Do they get a notice that just says, there's information missing, go figure it out? Or do we tell them, there's mental health information missing, and you ought to ask about that? And of course, the problem with that is, if you know the category, then you have perhaps already disclosed the sensitive information that is in that category, right? So you sort of obviate the point of having it sequestered if you tell the physician it's mental health information. The other letter I wanted to talk about briefly was the most recent letter, which had to do with personal health records, and that happened under the leadership of Leslie Francis and John Houston. You know, there's a move in the last administration to promote personal health records, and there's also a lot of concern at the same time because people are using them. There's kind of a freewheeling thing going on. I mean, there are many personal health record systems that are not covered entities. They're not covered by any particular, they might be covered by state law, but there's no federal law that covers them. And they're in that category of kinds of things that they're not covered. So, you know, many of the same, so I don't have them all in front of me now, but many of the same kinds of rules that we think should apply to electronic health records or similar to HIPAA protections is what the committee recommended for personal health records, even though many of them are, at the time of the letter, were largely unregulated. So we now have the Recovery Act. The Recovery Act does, from last February, ask, a year ago now, February, does regulate in part some things related to personal health records, either by my department or by the Federal Trade Commission, mostly related to breach disclosures. But what the committee said was a lot of things that relate to privacy and fairness. The people should be able to have transparent access to what's going on. They should be able to transfer their personal health record from one place to another easily. They shouldn't be beholden to one particular vendor. If they change their policy, they shouldn't be able to change their policy on the web and say, you should have known about it. They should give you explicit upfront notice when they're going to change the rules. You should have a reasonable time to back out and to move your information, if you've invested a lot of time in a personal health record, to some other vendor. And we heard from a wide variety of those that are not covered, like, well, I don't want to say who's not covered because we might want to regulate them, but ones that are not tethered to not being provided by providers or plans like Health Vault or Google Health or WebMD, those kind of folks. We had Patients Like Me in. How many of you know what Patients Like Me is? Yeah, a few of you. So this is like a social network for people who have particular kind of diseases, where they're very explicit and upfront and clear that they are going to take all your data, share it, and sell it. And the people who have these diseases like ALS or MS or whatever are sharing information about their experience on that with the understanding that it's going to be shared, but for the purpose of getting research data faster. They have, in fact, in some places, larger pools of people who are on a particular drug or whatever than the FDA has, and they, in some cases, we're finding, I had a nice conversation last night at dinner, finding that, that they're correlated actually with some of the better studies. So that's kind of interesting. What else do I want to say? I think that's it. I'm getting into Walter's time, and I don't want to do that. But I guess the final question is, like, so what? Okay, the committee makes these recommendations, and then what happens? And I think there are a lot of people who work for the committee or who watch what the committee's doing that are frustrated when they find that the secretary doesn't immediately take up that letter and go out and do something with it. And I have to say I'm less worried about that, because I think what you're going to hear from Walter in particular is industry is looking at what this committee is doing. This committee is made up of, not captains of industry who are there, kind of for show, to support the administration and so forth. These are real people who are experts in their field, who are incredibly, fortunate to have, I feel very fortunate to be working with them and to have them advising the secretary, and they're doing the real work. And so industry is actually looking very carefully at what the committee is doing and what it's recommending, and whatever the department is doing, industry is actually following the recommendations in part, and you find many of them have been, Congress is looking at them, they're rolled into legislation. And so I'm very proud to be working with the committee and feel very fortunate, and be happy to answer your questions after. But I want to leave enough time for Walter to talk to you.